Starting from his dad's low-profile but very rich New York City real estate business, managing working-class apartment complexes and middle-class outer borough housing developments, the young Donald J. Trump eventually used that start in dad's company to become quite famous. He parlayed the wealth and assets he got from his dad's company and a racy, built-for-the-headlines love life, and his own knack for self-promotion of his perceived business acumen. He parlayed that all into a lively life as a fixture in New York City tabloids. He parlayed that into a reality TV show gig and into assorted celebrity side projects like Trump-branded housewares and a short-lived Trump airline and Trump University, which was not, it turns out, a university. It was actually a fraud scheme for which he had to pay a $25 million settlement right before the inauguration. But when it came to his own supposedly core business as a real estate developer, just like Dad, over his decades in that family business, Trump developed a hardcore business reputation for reneging on his financial obligations, for failing to pay back bank loans. To the point where, by the time the 21st century rolled around, every bank in New York had blackballed him. Nobody would take him on as a customer anymore. Except one. A big bank called Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is the bank that continued to lend him hundreds of millions of dollars even after he was unable to pay that same bank back on some of his earlier loans, even after he went so far as to file lawsuits against Deutsche Bank when he failed to pay them back his side of the loan. He owed them $40 million and he didn't pay it. Then he sued them, alleging that it was somehow their fault that he wasn't paying them back, and they should pay him billions of dollars. I mean, there are aspects of the Donald Trump-Deutsche Bank relationship that have always seemed just way outside the bounds of normal business dealings. They have been uncommonly generous to him. And not just him, it's him adjacent, too. The whole Trump-Deutsche Bank uncommon generosity story got even a little more rich during the presidential campaign, when Deutsche Bank also gave Jared Kushner several $100 million in loans in October 2016, right before the election. And one of the reasons this financially inexplicable dynamic between Trump and this one big bank, one of the reasons it's been of interest for so long is because at the same time Deutsche Bank was the inexplicably generous lender of choice for Donald Trump and his family, no matter how much he abused them, Deutsche Bank was also neck deep in a Russian money laundering scheme. Barely a week after Trump's inauguration, Deutsche Bank got nailed for facilitating the laundering of $10 billion in dirty Russian money, and something that was called a mirror trading scheme in the business press. Now it turns out that $10 billion Russian money laundering scheme, that might have been Deutsche Bank's smaller Russian money laundering operation, sort of the bank's JV League Russian money laundering operation, because Deutsche Bank now also stands accused in a completely separate scheme of facilitating the laundering of 15 times that much Russian money, $150 billion. This was illicit cash that was spirited out of Russia through an overseas branch of the biggest bank in Denmark, randomly. For years and years, apparently nobody ever thought it was odd that this tiny Danish bank branch in Estonia was almost exclusively handling piles and piles of cash from customers who weren't Danish or Estonian. They were all Russian. And the bank that handled the majority of that branch's U.S. dollar transactions, $150 billion worth of these suspect Russian transactions, the bank that handled them was Deutsche Bank, allegedly. Deutsche Bank has reportedly been contacted by criminal investigators in the U.S. about this. Just this week, we learned that the U.S. Federal Reserve is also investigating Deutsche Bank for this alleged $150 billion in Russian money laundering. And of course, we don't know if there's any connection between Deutsche Bank's voluminous Russian money laundering troubles and the bank's very special, inexplicable relationship with the Trump family and the Trump Organization. We do know that as early as 2017, U.S. banking regulators were looking into Deutsche Bank's loans to Trump businesses. At the end of that year, there was a flurry of reporting that Special Counsel Robert Mueller had subpoenaed records from Deutsche Bank related to Trump. The New York Times later reported that those news reports sent the president into such a rage, he tried to fire Robert Mueller right then and there in response to those reports about Deutsche Bank. There is something as yet unexplained about the relationship between the president and this bank. I mean, back in 2008, when things between them by all rights should have fallen completely apart, when Trump owned Deutsche Bank $40 million that he had personally guaranteed, and he announced that not only was he not paying them back, but they should pay him $3 billion too, that crazy lawsuit he tried. I mean, that is like a dramatic way to break up with somebody. That is not a good basis for an ongoing, let alone renewed and deepened relationship. But that's actually what happened between him and Deutsche Bank after that stunt. He couldn't pay them back $40 million that he owed them. When they came for it, he was like, no, I'm suing you for $3 billion. What? And they responded by loaning him a ton more money. And the little twist in that has always seemed inexplicable is that what Deutsche Bank did there was they moved Trump over from another part of their bank to their private wealth division. That's how they got that $40 million payment that Trump wasn't otherwise going to pay them. They got it by letting him borrow it from this other part of their bank. They moved him as a real estate client into this other part of their bank, this private wealth division of their bank, which doesn't deal with real estate at all. It was always really strange. And this is where I point out that a couple of months ago, right after Thanksgiving, when German police raided Deutsche Bank's world headquarters in yet another new separate money laundering investigation that appears to be at least potentially related to Russia, the division of Deutsche Bank that authorities swooped in to search was Deutsche Bank's private wealth management division. The weird part of that bank that they shuttled him into when they started behaving really strangely toward him. And as I said, we don't know if the Deutsche Bank Jenga tower of money laundering problems has anything to do with their relationship with President Trump. Maybe Trump just really knows how to pick them. But there has been a lot, many tens of billions of dollars of illicit Russian money apparently pouring through Deutsche Bank during the time that Deutsche Bank has inexplicably kept finding mysterious pots of cash to lend to a client no bank in its right mind would seem to want. Which has always seemed like something we should know more about. And now it looks like we will. That's our news. Next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.